What does liberalism actually mean? Not the cable news version, the real philosophical tradition that emerged because humanity needed to figure out how to live with diversity without murdering each other. Well, if you think liberalism just means privatizing religion and kicking God out of the public square, get ready for this conversation with David Congdon. He's here to unpack why that's not the whole story and why we need to reclaim what liberalism actually has to offer. The Reformation may have opened Pandora's box of diversity, but we're never closing it. And in this conversation, David joins me to unpack and answer questions from a lecture he gave as part of our Democracy in Tension Summit. Well, it's a doozy. It's a fun one. Who wants to move beyond the calls for a post-liberalism? Anyway, we're going to have some fun in this conversation. It's great to have Congdon back on the podcast. And if you're interested in checking out the entire lecture series that his lecture's a part of, as well as others, you'll check it out in the links attached to this episode. Well, hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Tripp. Returning the podcast is David Congdon. And, David, you contributed a rather provocative lecture for the Democracy in Tension online summit, and we got a bunch of questions about it. So if you're listening and haven't watched the lecture or joined the summit, you should go click the link and do it, because it's a doozy, and the questions intense. Also, since we released the lectures, things have gotten a little wilder in the United States of America. The volume of freedom and liberty and winning that's going down is just a bit overwhelming. And are you feeling really patriotic?
You know it.
It's not every day people have an Uncle Sam outfit when we're recording interviews, David.
Yeah, it's my regular attire.
Yeah. So one of the things that you talk about in the lecture is you end up making a rather robust case in the need for kind of rejuvenating liberalism. And as both someone that is a theologian and works within publishing within kind of political philosophy and such, that is one of those words a lot of people use, and not always clear in the way it gets used in a host of language games. So I'd love for you just to kind of help clarify kind of historically about the origin of liberalism and how when we start to talking about the intersection of religion and politics, what are we talking about when we talk about liberalism?
I mean, that is the trouble these days. I mean, I think it's. I grew up as you know within a conservative kind of evangelical environment in which that was a four-letter word for sure, and still is for a lot of folks. And I'm not by any means trying to present liberalism as unimpeachable, beyond critique. It has a legacy of problems for sure, to be clear. But I do think that there are multiple liberalisms, and I'm not reclaiming all of them. There are certainly some liberalisms that need to die and are the root of a lot of problems. And I try to make that clear in the lecture. But there is a root idea, which I do want to get back to, that is, it's rooted in the Enlightenment, is rooted in a sense of universalism in the broad political sense. That is, that fundamentally it's an egalitarian idea, that every individual is of equal dignity, equal worth, has equal rights standing before the law, and that society should be ordered around that egalitarian equality, universal equality idea. So it's fundamentally a position that is oriented toward a universally equal society. That's the goal.
And one of the things that I find perplexing is just how much historical amnesia exists in human beings. And there are two parts of it that drive me up a wall. And also, why is it that the moment you're on my screen, I get intense from the beginning of the podcast on and start ranting? I don't know. You bring it out of me, David. But one of the things I loved about your lecture at the beginning is you give the historical context for the origin of liberalism. Like, before liberalism emerged, we had wars of religion all over the freaking place. And these aren't like wars like the Crusades. These are wars between people that differ in their interpretation of the Eucharist. This is what we were killing people over. You had the end of the Catholic hegemony. You had this, which they also kind of like thought there was more sameness than was really there. But the Protestant Reformation opens up what you call this Pandora's box of diversity. So then what do you do with it? Right? And so some people are like, oh, we got to have a Council of Trent. We got to like figure out how to tighten the hatches, keep Christendom rocking. Maybe they'll come back to it. And the others like, well, I don't think you can't close the box once you open this selfhood thing. So we got to do liberalism. What can we do so we can, I don't know, not kill each other about our different theories of the Eucharist, et cetera, et cetera. And like when you see that this is what human beings did when they all shared the same baptism and there was diversity, then you just add in, have you paid attention to our species, our biological inheritance, what culture has worked? It took us hundreds of thousands of years to figure out how to cooperate with more than individuals we know we shared kin networks with. So like, I just find the volume of historical amnesia when we talk about the diversity of us as a species we will never get rid of. If the Pandora's box of the Reformation's intense, now talk about a multi-ethnic, multi-religious world connected digitally. We can't get rid of that stuff. And so we have the idea of all these post-liberals you're going to introduce. I just think they don't know who we are as a species biologically or are aware of who we are historically. And so when I watched your video, I realized how much more I was into liberalism and it got me worked up. Yeah.
I mean, mission accomplished, I guess. I mean, I do think that, you're absolutely right. There's amnesia about this. But I mean, I actually do think that, I mean, the post-liberals, we'll get to them, but post-liberals in general, I think they do really want to enforce this sort of false or illusory, homogenous society. So they want this, they have this kind of, rose-colored, fictitious version of medieval Christendom in their minds that if we can only get enough authoritarian power in the office of the president, we can eventually suppress difference and diversity enough that we can recreate the glory days of medieval Europe. I mean, that's in effect the vision of the post-liberals. And so, they might be very clear-eyed actually about the nature of the human species. They are just willing to do whatever it takes to suppress that.
One of the other elements that you talk about in the lecture that was helpful is that while this kind of impulse of liberalism, right, to say be skeptical about concentrated power, to desire different forms of checks and balances, and that's looked different in different nation states and in different cultures, or to kind of embrace a growing pluralism and these kinds of things, underneath it was a compromise in the relationship of church and state, and more broadly, I think in the present, between kind of our the multiplicities of cultural identities that claim us, and the way we negotiate power between citizens. And so when you talk about that inheritance and the way it's looked in kind of liberalism 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, as someone who has valued that story, what has been learned or gained over time in the history of liberalism from its classical origins through the New Deal to the present?
You brought up a lot there. I mean, I kind of want to begin by looking at the issue of kind of church and state, religion and politics there, because I do think this is the point where I get critiques from the left for sure on, because one story of liberalism has been that what it effectively does is it privatizes religion, right? Religion becomes a realm of the private individual, the domain of the interiority of the person, separated from the public realm of politics. And you have that kind of wall of separation in Thomas Jefferson's language, right? And so there is a sense in which that is true about the liberal legacy. I think there are different ways of construing that, to be sure. But one critique I get from the left on this point is that, well, it undermines the ability for Christians to mobilize for liberation, for social justice in that kind of overtly political way. I don't think that's entirely true, but I do think that I want to press my leftist Christian friends to think carefully about what their vision of their ideal state is, because what I do encounter from some folks on the left here, from Christians who I'm sympathetic with. I do consider myself to be on the left, to be a leftist, really. But is their end game here to have a Christian state that is, effectively, a socialist Christian state, and what does that entail? What does that require of them to achieve that goal? And that's where I don't hear a lot of clarification on what they actually envision. I mean, it's one thing to critique the current vision or current version of liberalism in our hyper-capitalist, finance capitalist United States, with with all of its injustices very blatantly on view. That's one thing. But I want to hear more from the left regarding their vision of the future of what their ideal state actually is. Because effectively what I want to propose and what I want to say here is that, and I think you and I were just talking about this, we are inherently a diverse creature. We're going to have disagreements. We're going to have differences of views throughout, right? And that is all over the place. How do we make space for a society, for a nation that has deep ideological, cultural, social diversity as just part of its constitution, part of its makeup? I don't think there's any realistic way to repress that and get rid of that and to make a culturally homogenous society without effectively creating little microstates, like little microstates that all have their own culturally homogenous societies,
or ethnic cleansing.
Or ethnic cleansing, right? And both of those
which
are...
we're against, just to clarify.
Right. But both of those are programs on the right, and we see those being played out right now. They are clearly efforts to create culturally homogenous societies. And I don't think my friends on the left, on the Christian left, want that. I assume that that's not their vision, but I don't know how they intend to achieve their society without some robust liberal principles for pluralistic society. And so that's where I want to say, like, I'm on board with the economic agenda, but we can't dispense with liberalism as such, because what we've learned throughout the last several hundred years, we need protections in place for diverse views and ideas and cultural positions and norms. How do we protect that? That's what liberalism is about.
Yeah, and it seems to me that one of the challenges we're facing in the present are we haven't cultivated the elasticity needed to really include all of our neighbors, right? And so oftentimes we notice the way in which our own tribe are not being included. And so it's not hard to notice the rhetoric coming from the White House, because, well, if you make an AI video where the president's literally pooping on half the country, well, that's clear. But a lot of that resentment and stuff that we see animating people on the right comes from, they're the deplorables. They cling to their gods and their guns. This sense, the changing demographic of the country is one in where there's whole cultural forms of life that existed in the country for a while, represent a large portion of the country, that at least in the cultural space, they feel like, well, I'm being erased. And one of the challenges, I think, for more progressive or liberal or leftist Christians is we should be engaged in a kind of persuasive form of engagement, not an erasive one, because we understand it when it happens to us or to our closest partners. And part of that is that the structures of protections and the protections. And in the lecture, you talk about how the early on liberalism was good at doing negative rights, right? Treating people with equality in some broad sense, but failed at positive rights, where the left broadly are like, no, we have to actually, civil rights or workers' rights or environmental rights. And there's a whole story of kind of recognizing that positive and negative side of rights, but the cultural elasticity that's needed in an increasingly diverse world, I think, makes demands on everyone. And that tendency to notice where it's failing to include our friends or allies, but not recognizing the way others own cultural spaces, as eye-rolly as it may be to us, there is something illiberal about a growing number of people not thinking they even get to be themselves in the present.
Yeah, I do think the progression of liberalism that I trace out in my lecture, it's a growing, in some ways, an effort to fulfill an original vision of society that was not, it's not as if liberalism came out fully formed, ready to go. Here's the universal emancipatory society, like, go, just do it. There were deep structural injustices and biases and all the rest that just took a long time to work themselves out. So I think in some ways, liberalism is an eschatological vision of a society that has not been achieved. In this sense, there's a lot of overlap here between that and, say, a Marxist or a socialist vision of society, which I do think are congruent here. But but that also doesn't mean, though, that every vision or version of liberalism is inherently a better one than the previous one. That's
Right.
where the neoliberalism issues are abundantly clear. It's a regressive, deeply problematic vision that brings back a lot of the inequalities that liberalism was an effort to overcome early on. So anyway, I don't want to present it as if this is an evolutionary progressive scheme that is just continually getting better. It's very much not. But there are some core principles of equality and emancipatory life and existence that I think are still there and remain to be realized.
Yeah. Yeah. I think when you, at least in the American context, but in the post-war context in general, in Europe, you get the birth of states that, you get the birth of the deep state,
Right.
But which, in America, the expansion of workers' rights, Social Security, these kinds of things, ideally they're for everyone. They work really well in the support structure, GI Bill and things for white Americans. And then you get it expanded through civil rights movement or the feminist movement, or as we get to say even recently when now you can have, when LGBTQ members can get married and stuff like that. The connection between using government to protect or extend rights and the kind of cultural politics of it became triggering for a significant number of the population. At the same time, you get this reorientation of liberalism because of the changes of our economic system. Both, you talk about privatization, financialization, the efficiency, other words like that. So, I'd love for you to kind of help people understand that here the phrase neoliberal, this kind of third stage of liberalism, what is receded that you want to praise from the past, and what kind of assumptions or framings do the neoliberal project assume this kind of generated the antagonism at the heart of our cultural moment?
So, neoliberalism is a reaction to the New Deal liberalism that was, and the New Deal liberalism is a phrase that doesn't just refer to the New Deal. It's a way of talking about an effort to use the federal government to achieve more universal equality across society. So that includes the civil rights movement, it includes the Great Society, it includes other versions of this, which are all extensions of this idea, this vision that you actually have to have positive rights and benefits to society that are given to each person as a way of affirming their place in the society and protecting their human dignity. So neoliberalism is a reaction against that, and it claims the mantle of what's called classical liberalism, which is kind of that first stage liberalism 1.0, which is, as you point out, kind of more negative rights, just civil liberties in that sense. So it's protection from government in that sense,
Which is going really great these days.
And it's a really interesting moment now. Because you have these civil libertarians who claim the mantle of that first version of liberalism, who are many of them are now kind of there's like this conflict internally to them, right? Because on the
They're
one hand,
on the board of Palantir. So you can't be liberalism 1.0 and on the board of Palantir.
Well,
there's just something about the militarization of the surveillance state of citizens that are then hooked up to the private protected data of the state, then given access to both surveillance, control of one's bank accounts, pre-criminal diagnoses, like the erasure of the private subject that's essential to a democratic and liberal project. Well, we can get rid of that. But luckily we can still have assault rifles, Dave.
Yeah, I mean, you are seeing who actually believes in their libertarian principles and who doesn't actually believe in them. So like somebody like a Bill Kristol, has come out as a very strong anti-Trump kind of, voice, and, to his credit, whereas some of his other, uh, you know, colleagues in the neocon kind of period have clearly not, sustained their allegiance to those principles. So anyway, it's all quite messy, and we are seeing to what extent these labels have any meaning whatsoever, which is, it just kind of reminds me of the whole debate about evangelicalism. What makes an evangelical? And yeah, and ultimately it just comes down to, do you like these institutional figures who identify as evangelical or not? Are you a Billy Graham supporter or not? And I think these days it's become, are you a Trump supporter or not? Which really just what means to be a Republican or a conservative these days, which is kind of shows the hollowness, emptiness of a lot of these ideas. But insofar as there is an idea of liberalism, insofar as there is some intellectual, philosophical core to it that has any meaning, it has to involve some of these core ideas about liberty, freedom from tyranny, but also civil rights, equality, egalitarianism, emancipation. So that's the core of it that I want to reclaim. But again, we go back to your original question about neoliberalism. I mean, neoliberalism is just the financialization of everyday life, right? It's the privatization of society. And yeah, it was a disaster. It still is a disaster. And we're sort of seeing the death throes of neoliberalism right now. It's everything that Trump is doing is in opposition to that. He's actually nationalizing the economy in really stark ways. He's doing everything that the neoliberals thought that the socialists and the liberals and the Democrats wanted to do, but never actually achieved.
While Trump raising the working class's health insurance. Right. Yes. He was like, let me do the opposite of what my team theoretically is for as few people as possible. And he's like literally pooping on half of America while
more than half. Yeah. His policies hurt his own followers. Very much so. I really do think, I mean, to just be clear about this, I mean, his policies are going to devastate 90% of the country, at least 95. It's really this very small segment of the elite class of the wealthy who are benefiting from these policies. And anyways, that's a whole other conversation, but yeah.
Oh, yeah. You do something similar looking at the different versions of post-liberalism, but you talk about a number of common features that are broadly kind of the energetic center of the new right. And part of it is the meaning crisis that we might have, like when you encounter diversity, is like, where does the anxiety go? It goes to the individual having no given group to belong to, right? Like if the individual doesn't have meaning apart from the group, and now everything's is just turning up into all this diversity, then you freak out, and that means that like diversity is actually threatening to the common identity, usually American, usually Christian. Like you can start to put these words that get put in there, but the bit of it that I think is important is you emphasize how it always claims an existential crisis to justify emergency measures, where the kind of post-liberal move is to go, look, no, this has been great. It's been working up till now. But now that culture's under threat because we don't have our group collective, we don't have an identity, we have this crisis, the solution is the abrogation of liberalism. Like someone has to set this straight. You've tried turning the other cheek. Now what about smacking them around? You tried having Congress in session and people voting. Have you tried executive orders? You've tried the three different parts of the government holding each other accountable. Have you considered just having a unitary executive theory running rampant, ignoring the Constitution, imposing tariffs, regardless of what the Constitution said, because he's here to save the Constitution. You have to save it before you can use it. And the moment we get in that space, then you now have a logic where you don't know, like it's like you've set aside the actual rules of democratic engagement in order to say, and you remember the Trump tweeting the not actual quote of Napoleon, that it was like, you're not supposed to tell everyone this is what you were thinking. But of course, he tells his attorney general to go attack his enemies on fake Twitter. So anyway.
Yeah, and you have Stephen Miller admitting that he wants to use the Insurrection Act to just, give all power to the government. Anyway, to the president. You bring up the post-liberalism piece, which is important here. I mean, the reason why I structured the lecture the way I did was that I wanted to make sense of the different claims of the post-liberals, because they're all over the map. They have different things they're all trying to attack, and they all attack it under the label of liberalism. I don't think they're entirely wrong to do so, but it creates a messy, convoluted picture of what they're actually up to. So you have some folks like Deneen or Hazoni who are really focused on some more of the philosophical elements of liberalism, this idea of individual freedom, individual civil rights and civil liberties. But you have others who, are really attacking more the neoliberal economic financialization, which is I'm more on board. I'm more on board with that critique.
Yeah.
But it gets lumped into these other philosophical and cultural elements. So, and then of course you have the Christian right post-liberals who are really just opposed to pluralism as such and to the idea of a multiple religious belonging kind of society. So these different elements of liberalism that are connected to liberalism and its legacy in some capacity, I'm trying to kind of disaggregate them and make sense of it so we can see more clearly what the post-liberals are actually up to, who's attacking what and why, and kind of where it fits into that history of liberal thought.
As someone who, in the lecture, you're looking at multiple different theorists that come from different kind of orientations, but, are broadly post-liberal. Like, what are you most sympathetic to when you hear their description of the world and the challenges they're raising? Like, what are they getting right, or what should the advocates or champions of liberalism learn from the criticisms?
I mean, the obvious answer here is the globalization, neoliberal economic policies. I mean, that's the one where, I think you find broad sympathy from the left on this point, and I would agree. So the issue here, though, and this is where it gets really tricky. So the word globalization, it's certainly a pejorative term for those on the left, but it's a pejorative term for those on this kind of far right and the post-liberal right, for some similar reasons, but the word global here is doing work that is laced into other cultural issues as well. So when they attack globalism, right, that's not just globalization. It's a different term that they conflate. The post-liberals conflate the two terms intentionally so that they can bring in the economic element that is broadly sympathetic, people are sympathetic to. There's a huge swath of the American society that says, yes, globalization is a problem. We've lost our jobs, we've lost our factories, we've lost all of these elements that brought us prosperity and freedom and a way of life that we miss. So there's agreement on that point, but then it gets lumped into, okay, so globalization was the root cause of that. Globalism is like this now broader umbrella term in which we say, okay, so it's not just neoliberal Clintonian economic policies, it's also immigration, it's also migrants, it's also the other, right, in every version of that term. And so that's where that conflation is happening for the post-liberals, and that's how they're selling that message. Say, let's kick out the immigrants, and then suddenly, and let's set these massive tariffs, and then suddenly we'll get your prosperity back.
Yeah. I think one of the things that makes me stab my face when I think about the Democratic Party is the kind of dogged insistence that you could have political democracy without some form of economic democracy. Like, that just seems nuts, because that's what the neoliberal project tried, and it's generated multiple elections in a row where the actual Democratic Party didn't even decide who their candidate was, or the structures of the inherited Morning Joe picked the candidate rather than the policy. So, like, the to me, there's the commitment to liberalism 3.0 is like near blinding fundamentalist form of commitment in the Democratic Party, that the anxiety or fear or worry about what it's generating, the only place for it to go is the right. So like you can't get Jeffries to endorse Mondami, even though he got a better voting. More people turned out and voted for him than he did in his own district. You can't, like, remember what happened to Bernie when running for election, and then all of a sudden all the moderates drop out and then all endorse the same person, and everyone's like, "Oh, Obama helped everyone out," and you're like, "Yeah, he did, great job." So, like, to me, there's this sense that the neoliberal expression of statecraft is so blindingly normative for the Democratic Party. Like, I understand why people will go, "Well, I know that sucks." And honestly, like a Bernie Trump voter makes sense to me, and so
Yeah.
how do you see that? Because I find it amazing how even at this point, the Democratic Party can't imagine not being neoliberal. It's a real part of it's really the reason I drink bourbon at night.
For good reason. I mean, it is distressing. And yeah, I mean, I agree with, somebody like Phil Christman on this point, his book on why Christians should be leftist. Because I think, yeah, we have a problem right now where both political parties need to have billionaires in their back pocket to survive in our current political system. That's a problem. We simply have a broken political system in which you need billionaire money to survive. I mean, systemically, structurally, I understand why the Democrats support neoliberal policies, because they really cannot have a competitive election, at least in their minds, without some of those big billionaire donors. So they made a compromise there. I think we should reject that compromise, but that is understandable, I think, in terms of pure realpolitik, analysis, why they've done that. But like, to get to this larger issue, I mean, there's a lot that is packed into this here. I mean, our current situation, but you have folks on the left who, on the economic left at least, who did view and still do view social and cultural issues like Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ equality as distractions from their agenda, and ultimately, in competition with their economic agenda. And I do think so people like, there are journalists who have traced how a lot of those economic left Bernie supporters have gone to the far right, as part of their, they support the right-wing culture war, and see somebody like Jeff Hall, like Hawley as an ally because of his support for economic populism and his rejection of cultural populism in the sense of Black Lives Matter, other social justice policies. So, I mean, that's part of this convoluted picture, which I'm trying to say, no, you have to support diversity and pluralism all the way down. You can't simply say, let's embrace economic equality policies that reject billionaires while also then throwing trans people under the bus. Like, you can't do that. We have to find ways to do both, and that's what a liberal vision of society is meant to do. So that's my response on that point. But I do think we just have a broken system that is going to continually divide us on these issues.
I'd love to hear you kind of think through how liberalism handles like questions of identity now versus the beginning, because like in early liberalism, you hadn't had the ethics of authenticity kind of emerge and this kind of thing. And it seems to me that one of the places that have generated like a unique tension, which, well, at least it seems surprising to me, like that trans inclusion became a whole nother realm. I didn't quite get it until I moved back to the South and talked to enough people and realized that I hope they would hear themselves in this, and I hope it doesn't sound real judgy, but the sense that the moment you as an individual have this kind of gift of liberal freedom to articulate who you truly are and no one else has access to it. And then, but the moment there's an ethical expectation that other citizens are kind of a priori obligated to recognize you as you present yourself, and there's no inherited norm from it, then that element of, right, like, oh, okay, I was born this way, so now, look, welcoming a gay person, I know these other gay people, and I guess we can figure that out or something. But now you're telling me you're a girl, but you got boy parts, or you identify as a cat, or, whatever the algorithm tells them is the perfect example. It's probably a public school teacher that said it in the TikTok that they were shown 100 times, or that one ad that Trump ran 1,000,000 times, right? Like, underneath it, there's something about liberalism in the current present where the author of one's selfhood is the individual, and now it can generate categories that are detached, or at least beyond kind of inherited categories, that then just the recognition of them feels like a threat. Does that make sense? And what do we do with that? And when the articulation of one's own identity comes with an ethical expectation the other recognize it. That's one thing about race or gender or these kinds of things. But once it gets to culturally generated identity markers of some sort, then those in much more conservative things now feel a threat that maybe they didn't before.
Yeah. I think the core here of liberalism is this idea that you are not born as who you are always naturally supposed to be. In other words, that you're not born into a category or a box that defines you for the rest of your life. That idea that you are born into a category, born into an identity that's given to you, and that you are bound to, is a legacy of the medieval system, right? It's essentially a hierarchical society. I mean, it really goes back to antiquity, but
it's like baptizing babies versus believers' baptism.
Sure, yeah, exactly. I mean, that is tied up with that for sure. But it's everything about the hierarchical nature of the ancient medieval cosmos, in which if you are whatever gender you are, whatever you are, you a plant, animal, angel, demigod, like everywhere you fall into an order of being, wherever you fit, that's where you are. That's where you are always for eternity. That's your place in society, place in the cosmos. And so the pre-liberal world is one in which that hierarchy just is. That's the natural order of things. There's a natural ontological system that you have a location in. And that goes all the way down to the occupation you're meant to have. If you're what order you are in the birth order of your siblings, all these things are part of this divine, sovereignly ordered and providentially curated system of life. Liberalism is the rejection of that entire hierarchical order. It says, no, you are not defined by your birth. You're defined by the life and choices you choose as a free individual, the choices you make, the life you choose to make, the life you consent to. That is, you get to choose that. You have agency in that. So your identity is not defined by divine providence. It's defined by the agency you have as a free individual. That's the liberal idea in a nutshell. Everything else follows from that. And so I do think, this is why the post-liberals are so opposed to, or just opposed to just individual freedoms in general, but why they want a hierarchical society so much, and why they want natural law so strongly. They're all natural law theorists. And what's one of the really ironic things about the post-liberal period in which we're living is we're seeing so many of these Protestant evangelicals embrace natural law thinking in a way that would have been unthinkable 50, 60, 70 years ago. That it was such a legacy of Catholic medieval thought that a Protestant would have said, absolutely not. And you see that all over evangelical writings in the 50s and 60s and 70s. But now we're seeing these evangelicals completely embrace Thomas Aquinas, completely embrace natural law thinking, because they recognize that that is the logical extension of their rejection of individual freedoms and liberties. So if you reject liberalism, you really have to embrace a robust natural law framework for society. And so we're seeing a lot of people convert to Catholicism as a result of this, or just embrace Aquinas, embrace medieval thought. But it does stem from this recognition that these are all connected. And I do think the rejection of trans rights is an extension of this rejection of abolitionism, suffrage. All these things are connected, right? These are all political movements designed to respect the agency of an individual. And if you don't respect the agency of an individual, you're going to embrace a rapist in the presidency. You're going to embrace, denials of sexual assault as a legitimate category. You're going to do all these things because it's all of a piece.
Well, I don't know, David. You might have thought Protestantism was against natural law, but they've been doing a performative contradiction for years. It really makes you feel bad for all the early Protestants that got killed over it.
Right.
You're like, little did you know, it'd only take a way to legitimate your prejudice for you to go, well, Aquinas has a point. Yeah, it is I'm sure a lot of them would be upset that you and I'd be like, I think you should be more Protestant. You remember like how Paul thought about the natural givens of society, culture, religion as things that were just kind of structurally incompatible with what happens in Christ? It was a good idea. This
is where I agree with somebody like Brad Gregory, who thinks that Protestantism is the cause of all of our problems of modern liberalism. I think his historical picture is rather simplistic, of course, but in some ways I think he's actually right. He's not wrong to see the Reformation as leading to a lot of these liberal ideas. It's just ironic to see these hardcore Calvinists and Lutherans and other people say, actually, we're on the side of the Catholic Church. So
yeah. Our mutual friend Travis at one point on the podcast just said, I don't believe anyone really believes in justification by faith if they aren't a socialist. Yeah. And that sent about enough angry emails that it could compete with the questions that I got sent for you. Now, okay, one topic before we go into specific questions. You connected some dots between post-liberalism and this political sphere to like post-liberal theology, which played a very significant role from the 90s on for mainline Protestants who, as denominations, became post-liberalism was a move away from liberal theological tradition, really shaping the life of American mainline Protestantism, thinking like Tillich and Niebuhr and company. Can you kind of help us connect the dots and maybe how people that haven't thought about political theory or political philosophy might have experienced post-liberalism showing up in congregational or denominational life?
Yeah, this is my own kind of pet interest for the last few years, just looking at the way post-liberal theologians from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, how their work, their project has helped to feed into the current political post-liberalism that we're seeing by people like Deneen, Hazony, and Rod Dreher and other folks. This is a controversial thesis. I had an article come out this last month about that, but I'll just kind of boil it down this way. So the so-called Yale School of Post-Liberalism, Hans Frey, George Lindbeck, and company, their project, I don't want to say that project was simply a direct, connection to let's let the president be a tyrant and, all the policies of Trump 2.0. But there is an intellectual through line that I want to highlight and say there's something about post-liberalism as such, whether it's theological or political in nature, that is connecting these histories and these trajectories of thought. What I think the Yale School and all the people associated with that school were up to, I think it can be boiled down to a couple like basic ideas. Essentially, they were trying to figure out how to make sense of God talk, Christian language in our modern fractured society. How do we make sense of Christianity and Christian unity when we're all so fragmented? So, the diversity is rampant. Their way of doing so, their way of addressing this problem was to say, okay, we can't actually go back to medieval Europe. We can't actually recreate Christendom in that form, even though they were very clearly nostalgic for that era. So the way to do that is instead, let's reject universalisms in general and retreat into our particular little communities, our particular cultural bubble of the church. So what post-liberalism does, and I think this is true for both its theological version and its later political version that we're seeing now, it's a rejection of universalism in every version. And I'm using universalism in a broad kind of theoretical, kind of social sense. That is, rejection of the human community as a universal community that we are connected to, responsible for. Instead, or what the conservatives today would call globalism. Instead, it's a retreat into culturally homogenous units that are culturally, ideologically, socially unified, and letting those kind of cultural bubbles and communities be the focus of our energy and our intention. So you have somebody like Hauerwas or Alistair McIntyre talking about the need to create these communities of virtue and character and formation. So kind of the separatist idea. Let's kind of withdraw into our church communities and completely restructure our life around that. You see this played out in Rod Dreher's Benedict option. There's a lot of different versions of that. So it's that rejection of this universal horizon of humanity. But I think the political takeaway from all that is, what we've seen, I think, over the last 15, 20 years is that Benedict option, that retreat into little communities of the church is not a sustainable or realistic political solution for the problems that the post-liberals wanted to address. And so they've said, okay, that doesn't work. We need to make the nation as such into a culturally homogenous community. That the church can't do that work, then the state can. Let's apply the same principles of post-liberal thought from the 70s and 80s, and let's apply it to the nation state. And that's what Trump does.
Yeah. All right. God, I have so many questions people send in. I'm going to avoid derailing. But Rob Dreher sucks. That's all. I just wanted to say that. The connection between the Benedict option and someone who, when you hang out with them, has been a dick is significant. The Venn diagram overlap.
Yeah, that's a circle there.
Well, I don't want to make it a universalist statement there, David. I got to make this space for grace, Okay, I picked the 20 most energetic questions I was sent because I posted yours on Substack, which then led people to send me emails. So I want you to just pick numbers between 1 and 20 because I couldn't decide. They vary in topic, and some of them just seem so wired that I just thought they'd be fun to read on the internet and let you say whatever. So any number between 1 and 20.
Let's go with 5.
Ooh, okay, 5. Hey, David. I'm just being internet angry guy. Is it really intellectually honest to lump Catholic integralists, economic populists, and fascists together as post-liberal when they have fundamentally different visions of society? Come on.
Because they formed a coalition. I mean, it's not they are working together. I mean, it's I don't think that's a controversial statement today. I mean, we are actively seeing them partner together and work together in a political coalition. I mean, coalition politics has always been about that, right? There's a coalition politics of the left back in the Great Society period, and before there's a coalition on the right that has been in place for the last 20, 30 years, but it's really become a unique monster of sorts over the last 5, 10 years. So yeah, they absolutely are working together, and they have been.
All right, what's your next number?
18.
Oh, here we go. David. This is how I read angry comments and emails to me. David, your entire framework assumes legitimate authority comes from individual consent, but, and this is in all caps, but, what if most individuals would freely choose illiberal systems? Should we override their choices? Thanks for your attention to this matter.
Well, okay. I mean, I appreciate the question because this gets at the heart of this dilemma. And I get this from the left a lot. What do you do with stupid people? right? What do you do with people who choose things that are abjectly awful, are just clearly horrible positions to hold, you know, and and so then I want to ask them in return, what are you proposing instead? Because I do think that the solution from some of these folks is somebody in charge who's the philosopher king gets to tell them how to live, right? It gets decided for you. This is the right way of life. Now, I might agree that that way of life is the right way to live, but do we really want that kind of society? Is that honestly the model of society that we are advocating for? Because the reality is there's never going to be an ideal system here that we're all going to agree this is the universally right way of living. So I do think the liberals were right that the solution here is to create a system that prevents the worst excesses from ever getting into positions where they can go and destroy society. Now, we might say, and I would agree, the safeguards that were put into place, say in the United States, were deeply deficient, absolutely inadequate to the needs of our society. I'm not defending the U.S. Constitution here as the way to achieve this kind of liberal democratic pluralism, not at all. But something like it absolutely has to be in place to prevent rampant abuses. So we can talk about what those might be, but what I don't think we can advocate for is just let the right person in charge dictate for all of us how to live. That's not the way to go.
All right. Next number. What number you want?
9.
Oh, okay, 9. All right. We'll give this reader a different voice. He's a redneck. How can you champion both cosmopolitanism and long-term institution building when cosmopolitan elites like yourself are precisely those with the least investment in local institutions?
That is an interesting misunderstanding of the word cosmopolitan. I mean, cosmopolitan is here being conflated with a certain kind of wealthy elite status. That's not what that word is being used to mean here. I mean, I'm using the word cosmopolitan in its Kantian philosophical idea here, but so I guess I just reject the premise of the question. But no, I mean, it's just flatly not true that you can't be cosmopolitan and be invested in local institutions. That there's no contradiction there.
Well, okay, so this was a very long email, and later on in it, this individual decided to tell both of us, you three are really invested in liberal institutions that are just going through train wrecks. And he's like, aren't y'all invested in the church, education, and publishing? Those all seem to be utter failures these days. Maybe y'all are just venting.
Yeah, I mean, I am venting in some ways about the destruction of what I think are public goods and public important aspects of life. So yes, I mean, I do want a robust public space for the distribution of knowledge. That's publishing, right? And thinking for social institutions that respect and protect civil liberties and civil rights. I mean, yeah, so these are all on fire. I agree. But that's why we need to have a robust liberalism to protect them. I don't see the connection point here to why liberalism is the problem when liberalism is exactly what's being undermined in these institutions. So anyway, yeah.
All right, we're going to do number 3 because this one makes sense, and it wasn't immediately triggering for me upon reading it. You claim that liberalism isn't crisis-based, but wasn't neoliberalism's response to the 2008 crisis essentially socialism for banks, austerity for everyone else, proving liberalism serves capital in a crisis?
Yeah, I mean, the problem here is the premise that neoliberalism is liberalism as such, right? That's the problem. That's just not true. I think neoliberalism is undermining liberalism in every way. It's a rejection of liberal principles all the way through, other than the one principle of, I guess, private property, I suppose. But that isn't a principle that I view as essential to liberalism. in toto. So anyway, so I reject the premise.
Yeah, well, but I think it's important, right, that a lot of the conversations that take place in the public square will essentialize a neoliberal
Right.
form of liberalism in which the economic needs of the whole are undermined for the needs of the few. And the one of the examples, and I can't remember who it was in the summit brought this up, is like when you take say immigration as just an issue, there's like the political crisis around neither party really wants it solved because there's investments for both of them to do it. And their shared investment is how we have a whole economic system that actually needs unprotected workers who don't get the benefits of political and economic liberalism here to be exploited to then create the labor network to support the larger American society, that our state actually functions to enforce the economic laws around labor needs versus the actual political laws that they refuse to solve, right? Like who's leading who? One of the impacts of neoliberalism, be it in immigration or in trade policy and all these kinds of things, has been for the economic power to tell political power what it's supposed to do. And they're like naive neoliberals or neoliberal true believers think that it will be better if we do that, right? Like you could see that come to dominate the moment Bill Clinton says the end of big government's over. He's like, actually, the state should be led by the market, and a savior is an engineer. And I think that oftentimes the criticisms of liberalism and the impacts of liberalism on culture are exacerbated when you equate kind of an economic neoliberal order with the promise of democracy writ large.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I agree. I mean, think back to the question. The person asking that question made a point about socialism for the banks and for the wealthy. So I want to say yes, I agree. That's a problem. It's a problem because that policy was anti-liberal in its actual execution, insofar as if liberalism is about respecting and affirming individual agency, that includes the agency of workers, right? The agency of laborers, and the value of their labor, and that they should have, that labor should be given its economic value that's due to it. And that means I do think that there's a liberalism that is essential to socialism, right? That socialism is a manifestation of a kind of liberal policy of the individual value, dignity, and importance of the laborer. And so that policy, like the bailing out of the banks, is a rejection of that individual agency, a rejection of liberalism in that fundamental sense that I'm trying to articulate. So,
yeah, and I found a very helpful way of making that point, that you might learn if you're doing calls for Bernie Sanders, his first time running for president, is: do you want a political system that in a time of crisis says we have to save the populace, or is the indispensable element we have to save the banks? Because both the logic that ran through both parties in the bailout was what is indispensable for this nation is financial capitalism, its structure, and its integrity. What was perfectly okay throwing under the bus are a large number of middle and working class people who had homes that lost it, a lot of near retirement and just retired people who had to go back to work and no longer get the time to spend with their kids and grandkids that they were looking for. The actual finitude of an overwhelming majority of people was expendable to the Democrats and the Republicans, but what wasn't was the investment incomes of people that get taxed half as much as working people on the money they'd make just making off their wealth. And if somehow you think that correlates to a gospel where you can choose God or mammon, you could give Satan a handy. I don't know what to tell you about that. It's just ridiculous. Thank you for coming to Tripp's TED Talk.
Amen.
That's why it drives me nuts. Okay, there are two questions that are similar here about the critique you are giving post-liberalism, and I'll read two of them, and then you'll get the point. So one questioner said, if post-liberals are wrong about the need for a kind of homogenous shared culture and values, or limiting the spectrum of cultural diversity, how do you understand the seeming success of culturally homogenous democracies like, say, Denmark or Japan? Right. So there's that question, and then another one asked you're criticizing Deneen, one of the post-liberal theorists from the lecture, who equates individual agency as agents of chaos, right? And so you need this homogenous shared cultural value. How doesn't he have a legitimate point that this kind of individualism leads to the atomization and loneliness that are rampant under our current cultural moment?
Okay, so those are thoughtful questions, and I think there's some helpful points there. I mean, sure, if you have a culturally homogenous nation, like a Norway or a Denmark or Japan. Now, these are not actually culturally homogenous, but mostly, it's mostly enforced. Sure, there's success you could have there. And that's true. I mean, there's a lot of work shows that a culturally homogenous community can get a lot done. You can do a lot of work with that. There's a reason why the church growth theorists at Fuller back in the 70s and 80s talked about the need to have kind of churches that were culturally homogenous, because, and they were right, a culturally homogenous church grows faster, has more vitality, and tends to reproduce and expand. Sure. I mean, culturally homogenous communities can do that. The question is that what we want? Is that the goal, the aim of society, is simply to be successful, to grow, right? And that's always been the response to the church growth theorists. And I would say the same thing to political theorists today. Is the goal of society to be as successful as possible, to be as economically powerful, to be whatever success measure you want? Is that the goal? I'm proposing that that's not the goal of society, is to be just financially or numerically successful. And I would argue that a lot of those societies, you look at Japan and other ones, are unsuccessful in many other measures, right? Okay, so we can set that aside too. But in any case, I think the question here is, can we have a diverse, pluralistic society and create the safeguards necessary to sustain and preserve that kind of society? Is that a good worth preserving? I think it is. I think that's a good worth preserving. But if that's not, if enough are saying we're done with that, then of course Trump is the way to go, or whatever left-wing version of Trump you want to have. I think that's a real loss. I think it's a loss to the world. I think it's a loss to society. And I think there's a lot to be gained from having diverse communities that learn to experience and embrace differences within them. I think there's a lot of good there. And it may not look like success like we're used to measuring success, but it might be a moral and political good in other ways. So as for the atomization point, I mean, sure, I think there are ways in which maybe perhaps the respect for individual agency, you can see how that might lead to an atomization in society. I don't think that's a necessary development. I don't think it's necessary to go from individual agency to mass atomization. I think there are safeguards and ways that we can have robust communities where those social bonds are not lost. Because otherwise, what you're saying is the only way to have a healthy, socially engaged society is for us to all be on the same page about things, for us to be born into a community that we're in some ways bound to, right? Whether that's a church or a nation or something like that. The question is, are we able to consensually choose communities that are, new and different, or do we have to simply adhere to traditions and long-standing rituals and liturgical communities as the only way to form community? I don't think that's the case.
Yeah. Okay, here's something I've been thinking about that, and you tell me. I just want to know what you think, because it seems to me like if you were taking atomization and loneliness, the feature that explains that growth the most, like if I was making a blame pie, and I thought of this recently when I was looking at, was working on this thing with Dom, and he had asked questions about political philosophers reading Paul, right? And this is in Badou's work. The tweetable way of saying one of his observations is that in neoliberalism and identity are subjects that are with market space, right? And so like a neoliberal form of inclusivism is now we add a whole nother identity marker that we can market to, right?
Yep.
And then sometimes you get in trouble for it because you might give a trans person the wrong beer and then it gets shot or whatever. But the moment, or you can see like the capitalism loves pride festivals, right? Like they're all, this is not a politically partisan statement that identities are subjects with market space. The moment you have a neoliberal agenda and now have capitalism surveilling everyone with algorithms, the individual subject, the atomistic subject, is now has their own market space. Like everyone in your house, if we all watch the same TV channels, used to had to be a shared market space. Now the algorithm you have is your own, like you are your own market space. And that creates both a de-narrativization of the world that has problems. It has the cultivation of resentment, fears, and all the things that advertising does. It's now doing it to you, and then the majority of one's relationships in the day are mediated by algorithms that want them to feel deficient, so they can have a solution to their unique atomized identity or their situation of loneliness. And so we get simulations of connection that continue to fund loneliness without embodied interaction. We take the friction of otherness that was the very feature that makes human sociality able to evolve and emerge, and now we want to create a homogeneous sameness for each individual, filtering out their reality and their web of relations. So we self-sort and then get self-marketed to. It seems like if I was naming where atomization and loneliness come from, it's that capitalism found a way to impact our precognitive awareness of the world through algorithms and technology that we're fascinated by, and we haven't cultivated the attention and contemplative practices anymore to engage with the otherness of ourself, let alone the otherness of our neighbors. I don't see underneath the premise of the question is that it's individual agency that creates chaos. It's actually like taking identity, narrowing it down to an individual subject and making that a unique, accessible, monetizable market space. And then going, whoo.
I agree with all that. I also want to provide another theory here, which is,
okay.
So back to my point about how some of the traditional structures and hierarchies of society have broken down in modernity because, we don't believe that we're just born into a stable set of conditions and norms. What I do think what we're seeing over the last century, half century or so, is that a lot of the leftover pieces of Christendom, of medieval European Anglo-American society have crumbled. And the things that have crumbled are the kinds of communal bonds that were just given to you when you were born, right? A church community that you were just assumed that you had to belong to from at the get-go. Or a suburban neighborhood, right? In terms of the post-war period, a suburban neighborhood that was your communal network. You had a bunch of white people on this with the same picket fences and all the rest. That was your neighborhood environment. You all got along, and you kids played together at the local park, and you went to church together. Like a lot of those communal associations have broken down, and the reality is a lot of people are just assholes. Okay. And especially a lot of these men are just assholes.
What?
and they can't reform those bonds without them being basically created for them. And they require a society in which other people are forced to interact with them. So whether that's the incels who can't get a date because they just view women as objects that to be conquered, or whether it's these tech bros who don't know how to interact in society with people who may not think that their visions of long-term technological utopias is like the most important thing in the world, or whatever it might be. Like a lot of people are just so incapable of treating other people as real, decent subjects in their own right, and they can't form those communal bonds on their own. So they're longing for a society in which those communal bonds are forced upon those other people so that they can have those communal connections given to them. I think that explains a lot of it, where we just don't have a society of people who are socialized into how to interact as real people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How do you think through the critique that liberalism's neutral public square ends up enforcing a secular Protestant cultural hegemony that marginalizes non-Western worldviews and makes it difficult, say, for like one of the attractions of Christian nationalism is like, oh, we get to be Christian again. And then that clearly meant putting 10 Commandments up in school. But how do you negotiate the neutrality of a public square when what becomes normative is often a kind of secular inheritance of Protestantism?
There's a few things going on there. I don't know if I entirely accept the notion that it's a neutral public square. I mean, I think there are certain norms implicit in a liberal pluralistic democracy. So,
neutral wasn't scare quotes when the person sent it in.
So I mean, yeah, I don't think it's entirely neutral, but that's maybe beside the point here. So if I understand the question correctly, the issue is that implicitly here, by not enforcing a certain vision of society, which I take it to be is non-Western in nature, or at least however you want to phrase it, non-Christian specifically, I guess, that Christianity by default is going to dominate because of its numerical majority in this part of the world, and that's going to produce more of the problems. I guess, this gets at the same issue, right? The same issue of what do you do with people who just choose bad ideas, who just choose bad ways of living, bad political policies, all the rest. We're not going to eliminate their presence in society. We're not going to be able to, without endorsing a full-on, authoritarian regime. We're not going to be able to, or some sort of cultural revolution where you kind of reprogram all of these people. You're not going to be able to eliminate all that stuff. So what do you do instead? I think you just have to create very clear and robust sets of safeguards in society to prevent those people from amassing such power that they can do great harm to everyone else. That's a core part of it. I mean, beyond that, you also have to have robust positive policies that enforce protections and privileges and rights for everyone across the board, that even if they do have those policies and positions, there's enough protections against that. So, I mean, that's a part of it. I mean, that's not the whole picture, but I think you have to structure society in such a way that you acknowledge their presence in the world. Right? We can't eliminate their presence.
Yeah. It seems that advocating for individual autonomy while acknowledging neoliberalism's failure misses something. Isn't maximum individual choice exactly what created my current hellscape of gig work, student loans, and eroded communities?
I mean, no, it's not. It's not what it's not what produced that. This is like those evolutionary psychology explanations where you say, like, the reason why we have, our rate of divorce is because some, hominid back 10, 20,000 years ago decided to, harvest food this certain way, right? Like it's maybe a piece of the puzzle, perhaps, but it's not an all-encompassing explanation. You can't explain everything about neoliberalism just because of individual agency. That's an absurd argument. You could run that the other direction too, that it's the actual destruction of individual agency that has happening under neoliberalism. I mean, you can run this both ways. So no, I mean, you can't blame it all on individualism. There are a dozen other factors that I would say are more important here, but it's this kind of grand narrative explanations that you see a lot by the post-liberals. Brad Gregory saying, because Luther's justification by faith alone, we get, broken families and, a rampant income inequality. Like, no, that's not, you can't create those kinds of simplistic causal narratives. They don't work that way. That's not how history works. We really need a more nuanced account of how society develops. That's just facile.
But what's fascinating is all three of the current hellscape elements are thoroughly neoliberal, right? That the freedom of marketplace engagement generated gig work, where there's literally no reciprocity between the employer and employee. Like they don't even get the basic rights that exploited people with a job contract get.
Freedom. Right.
Yeah, they get real true freedom. The hellscape of our student loan debt crisis is oh, we want to support the freedom and possibilities of every student, but it secretly became a way for universities through the gifting of more debt to channel more and more money towards administration and recruitment of students. And then the amount that actually gets spent on the actual education. I promise you, we both know a lot of professors in the last 20 years, when the cost of all these universities quadrupled, it is not because the sociology professor and the biology professor are just like, oh, junk, I'm pulling down $500,000. So what's happened in the university system is very much its neoliberal thing, as opposed to,
just to be clear, these are destructions of what liberalism achieved in a previous era, right?
right.
Labor unions are a function of liberalism, right? These are all elements of liberalism in action. Government policies that support higher education and fund it and make it free for people, that's liberalism. It's just like, we can't, like, neoliberalism is bad. We agree, right? That's not the natural, necessary expression of liberal philosophy. It's not.
It sounds like what we really need is a political movement that just wants to celebrate, like, democracy across all the spheres of life.
Right.
Because
exactly. Yes.
Freedom is something engaged in mutually.
Absolutely. And I would say, I mean, again, I will grant there are different versions of liberalism. That's fine. The version that I am defending and promoting here is what is often called radical democracy. And that's the brand of liberalism that I'm trying to promote here. So, yes, I agree. A democratic party in that sense of the term would be phenomenal.
All right. So there are a stack of questions around power and authority. And there's a number of them that have the identifying liberalism with neoliberalism, because that's when you're looking at the problems today. But there's one of them that I think might be helpful, is that isn't the real issue that liberalism promises a kind of procedural fairness while delivering substantive inequality, and people end up rejecting the whole game as rigged, right? And you can see this is a bipartisan and cross perspective of identifying the system of liberalism as rigged for different reasons that gets us to disengage. And there's a long paragraph followed by I share your concern about concentrated power under both post-liberalism and a neoliberal form of liberalism. But what do we do for those that are genuinely liberal who want to address unaccountable corporations, NGOs, international bodies, where a lot of the people on our complaint list are the ones more effectively critiqued by post-liberals, because the media would like to censor genuine liberal critiques towards these orgs? So both of those things,
well, that's
a
very interesting argument there. I mean, I disagree that these corporations are more effectively critiqued by post-liberals. I simply disagree with that. But if I understand the question correctly, they're saying that because liberal views are censored out by the media, that you can get more airtime if you join up with the post-liberals and join up with that camp, you can get those critiques through. I would say I don't think it's worth making a deal with the devil to get those policies passed. It's just not. I mean, that kind of thinking leads to some really bad stuff. Once you make that deal, I mean, I don't know. I just cannot endorse and support that kind of, I mean, that is hardcore realpolitik. That is some really ruthlessly realistic approach to politics. I mean, in some ways I respect it, but
the example they gave was the Hawley bit. Senator
Hawley.
Wow.
I mean, Josh Hawley.
Someone who raises their fist on January 6th.
I'm in Hawley State. He is my senator. No, please do not support allying yourself with Josh Hawley as a way to get these agendas passed. He will not deliver those policies. I mean, this has been proven again and again. It's what the post-liberals are doing. They don't actually truly support economic populism. I mean, some of them seem to at times. I mean, this is a critique I have about Bernie. We can get beyond that. I mean, Bernie I like Bernie, but he doesn't choose the best friends, the best allies here. Has been made very clear in recent days. But him and Hawley working together, it doesn't deliver, and it doesn't deliver because ultimately Hawley's allegiance is not to these economic positions. His allegiance is to the party institutions and individuals who will maintain his power and maintain his seat, and that's not going to deliver in actual. I mean, it's like Trump's promising these immigrants, if you just agree to self-deport, we'll give you, $3,000 or whatever, and then he's not delivering. He's not paying them. He's not giving them that money.
No way. Are you
surprise,
serious?
surprise? Right? And it's the same thing with Hawley. You make a deal with the devil, and you're going to be left high and dry.
Yeah. So, towards the end of your lecture, you talked about like thinking other ways about kind of the future and the need for kind of building institutions or rebuilding ones, especially when you think of the kind of growing and increasing distrust for most of the inherited institutions, many of which have been kind of captured by class interest and such. What makes you think new institutions would fare better? Or what is it like to think about institution building when so much of the public square is dominated by apologists for failed institutions and apocalyptic prophets against all of them?
I'm not sure if I entirely understand the question. Is the idea here that we should just join up with the traditionalists?
No. I think it's the question's really like at the end of the lecture, you talk about the need to build. We need new institutions to have a more vibrant liberalism. So many of our institutions, universities, media, NGOs, these kinds of things have been captured by a neoliberalism, right? And they're widely distrusted because they have a very narrow interest, right? Like, think of the reason you ever end up being in mainstream news isn't because you were told what you have to believe. You just wouldn't have been advanced unless the investment bankers that pay for most of the advertising on mainstream media, you aren't going to be critiquing the military industrial complex, big pharma and stuff, and then get a job at CBS where they're paying for everything. There's the selection bias that runs through advancement in these institutions that makes them now distrusted and all this kind of stuff. And so when we're thinking
I mean, I understand the widespread distrust of institutions in general. I get that. There's a part of me who is sympathetic with kind of the anarchist left. I get that. That's an understandable position to hold. I am convinced that a kind of institutionalism is necessary to sustain long-term social change. It's fine. This is kind of a critique of kind of flash in the pan, kind of cultural protest, where it's not connected to an effort to actually build reproducing political power, and actually building political power. It's true that institutions inevitably incite kind of responses and critique and distrust and all the rest. That's a natural part of just social development and change. So you have to anticipate that, and you have to build into your structures a capacity for self-critique, right? And a capacity for change. So protecting an institution is not in itself the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is to protect the vision of society that those institutions are being built to support, right? So your goal is the beloved community, or whatever it is, your vision of a better world, a better society. And the institutions that you build to get there are not ends in themselves. They are means to that end. And if you need to have new institutions to replace ones that have gone corrupt or ones that have gotten weak and incapable of producing that social change, then yeah, you replace them. You replace those institutions. But you need something. You can't get to that goal without something that that allows you to sustain change and create long-term benefits. So we can't do without institutions. We can't do without people holding political office of some kind, right? That's not a realistic society. My challenge to people here on the left is to say, like, what do you actually want? Do you want to kind of withdraw into these like little communes that are off the grid and you can kind of pretend the rest of the world doesn't exist? That's fine. I mean, I'm supportive of you doing that if that's what you want to do, but the rest of us can't live in that kind of world. We have to find some way to create societal level change and growth and development and progress that's actually beneficial to the whole. And so we need those institutions to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. One last topic this is trips. This isn't from one of these questions. Now you had a shift, was it 3 or 4 years ago vocationally towards editing and
Well,
publishing?
I've been in publishing now for 13 years.
But at Kansas State, when was that?
I moved to Kansas 8 years ago for that.
Okay, 8 years ago, where you're working a lot more in politics, political theory, and such.
Right.
And before that, in theology broadly and such. So, no, when you make that shift, all of a sudden you're not just occasionally reading books of political philosophy. You're working with authors and the development of stuff and writing it and getting to going to a lot more guild meetings there and things. What kind of questions, insights, possibilities have you gained in 8 years engaging in that part of the academy that your constructive theological friend should hear when, say, thinking about ecclesiology or understanding the nature and mission of the church or the church's engagement in the public square? Because if you ask a biblical scholar what they learn about theologians when they use the Bible, that's usually like, well, their version of New Testament is always 30 years behind because it's what they learned in seminary, right? And when we think of what happens for theologians and ethicists, when we think about engaging in politics or political theory, it has that same thing where there's a whole shifting process of what's happening in that area in the academy. Then someone writes the 1 or 2 books that starts to move it beyond the silo of their discipline, and then it gets picked up by us theologians who love hanging out across disciplines. So when thinking about all the challenges we're facing in the present and the church's ongoing identity crisis about, its vocation in the world and all that kind of stuff, like, are there particular things that would have been on your radar or ideas you wouldn't have encountered if you hadn't spent the last 8 years working within a different part of the academy?
Certainly. I mean, I do think that my work in kind of political science and in law and this kind of area of the academy has definitely exposed me to a lot of these ideas. I mean, that's part of the reason why I'm interested in political liberalism and its history and its possibilities. I would not have been engaged in that topic if it weren't for the books I was working on. I mean, I don't want to say that, the what's happening in, say, political science or political theory or constitutional studies, like that, there's like answers there that are going to fix all of our problems. I don't think that's the case. A lot of the scholars in these fields are very much stuck in an earlier world and have not really grappled with where we are right now. I think I have pointed out this problem on social media in the past about kind of the deep abiding conservatism in these fields that has kind of impeded them from really addressing some of the problems that are facing our society today. So in that sense, this is a critique for those fields as well. I think that's important. That being said, I've also just learned how nuanced and in very carefully crafted these arguments are. Liberal political philosophy is deeply insightful and well informed and has a really robust set of internal critiques and dialogues that are happening there. And so it's certainly not the picture of neoliberalism that one gets from the questions maybe that you're getting in response to my lecture. And I recognize that my lecture is very superficial in a sense. I'm not doing a deep dive into a lot of these liberal theorists. I'm giving an incredibly high level 30,000 foot, 50,000 foot overview of these ideas. So I accept the critique on that point, but that the field is really rich and has a lot of insights to give. And I think it would be worth people reading more political theory to understand what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this has been fun. I always enjoy hanging out with you. And next time he needs to not have a stack of questions, because then things can escalate in a different direction. But
it's been fun.
Oh yeah. And I wonder if when's the next book coming out? Because it should be soon, right?
Yeah, it won't be for another year just because of the way the publishing process takes so long. But hopefully next October, November is when the next book's coming out. So
But the article on post-liberal theology and its relationship stuff is out recently, right?
That's out with the Journal of Religion. Yep, called
cool.
What has New Haven to do with Hungary?
Cool. Can you send me a link to it, and I'll post it with the podcast?
Will do.